Welcome back to our second Stories of Change webcast, hosted by the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations as part of the 20th anniversary celebrations of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change. The Tyndall Centre is a partnership of universities working together to develop sustainable responses to climate change. And for 20 years, they've provided evidence to inform society's transition to a sustainable, low carbon and climate resilient future. Here at CAST, our focus is on the social science of climate action, and we work to understand the role of people in shaping a positive low carbon future. As part of the Tyndall at 20 celebrations, we want to share and celebrate how successful low carbon initiatives can lead to permanent change and meaningful action on climate breakdown on a larger scale. We want to explore actions that have a ripple effect, planned or unplanned, that lead to new conversations, different habits, even new initiatives and policy changes. So today we're really pleased to welcome Professor Mike Hulme, Professor of Human Geography at the University of Cambridge, and hosting today's discussion is Dr. Stuart Capstick, Tyndall Centre researcher and Deputy Director at CAST. I'll now hand over to Stuart to get us started.
Thanks, Hannah. Yes, it's a real privilege to be able to speak with Mike, who was founding director of the Tyndall Centre in the year 2000 until moving on, I believe, in about 2007. So as we celebrate 20 years of Tyndall, who better to speak to than the man who began it all? Mike is one of the world's leading experts on climate change. His expertise spans the physical and natural sciences, climate policy, the social sciences, humanities, and beyond. He has published on everything from global circulation models to media reporting on climate change to literary and historical perspectives on climate. His book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, which I handily have here, is one of the most important pieces of writing for anyone seeking to understand how and why this topic is so difficult and contentious to address. I think it's fair to say Mike's thinking has preempted many of the debates that might seem new and raw to many of us in the year 2020. For example, the ways in which scientific facts and values are unavoidably entangled, and the risks of evoking points of no return or a sense of catastrophe in response to climate impacts. So in this webcast, we'll hear about how and why the Tyndall Centre was set up, and I hope we can also learn something more broadly about the place of climate change research in society. So welcome, Mike. First of all, could you tell us a bit about the origins of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, why it was set up, and what you were looking to achieve?
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you for inviting me onto this. I should also just preface this. I mean, I was the one who set it up. You said no, that's not quite true. I think when we put together the proposal to secure the funding for the Tyndall Centre back in 1999, I think I think it was the game of musical chairs. You know that you have to quickly find a chair, and there's one person left out. Find a chair, which actually ironically meant that I was the chair of the organising committee that put the proposal together, and that led a year later to me taking on the role of executive director. So it was very much a team effort back in 1999 when we put our proposal into the research councils, and that was the origins of the Tyndall Centre. It was an initiative taken by the new Blair government, who came in 1997, big commitment to science funding, new money released into the research councils, and a year or two later out came this call for proposals to set up a new interdisciplinary centre on climate change. And at the time, the late 1990s, there were, hard to think about it now, actually remarkably few universities who were doing any type of coordinated research on climate change. Obviously, our university, the University of East Anglia, had been in the game for a long, long time. There was the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, the Hadley Centre, of course, part of the Met Office. But actually, apart from that, there was not really much coordinated, connected research at all going on climate change. And so this bid that we put together, it was set up as a multi-university consortium. I think that was stated in the terms of reference. And it was an interdisciplinary proposal as well. So we at the University of East Anglia had expertise in environmental science and some of the economics and social science around global change, but we didn't have any engineering expertise. We did not work with psychologists, environmental psychologists. We were somewhat limited in some of our sociological capabilities. And so the whole consortium of, I think it was 8 or 9 different institutions around the UK was intended to put together a capacity to extend the ways in which we thought about the interconnectivities around the challenges of climate change. And that proposal was indeed successful. And so in 2000, we kicked off with this consortium in place. I think many of the institutions there are perhaps still part of the Tyndall Centre today. It was interesting looking back on that where some of the gaps were. I mean, I'd come at this out of the climatic research unit where I'd worked for, 10 or 12 years, very much on the climate data, climate scenarios, climate impacts, and adaptation side of things. Others of my colleagues had got different capabilities. What we didn't have, looking back on it now, and this partly reflects also my own later research on climate change, we had no engagement with the humanities disciplines at all. And we had no expertise in, let's call it ethics or philosophy. And those are 2 areas, 2 domains that I think, maybe we'll come to this in a later question, 2 domains that I think have become increasingly, and still are, absolutely central if we're thinking about understanding some of the challenges that lay ahead of us with climate change.
Mm. That's really interesting. Do you think that back in 2000, was research kind of more siloed or self-contained? Were there people doing kind of the modelling and then other people doing sociology? How did you find bringing those different disciplines together? How did that work out?
Yeah, I think it very much was more siloed. I mean, we in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia, I mean, we'd sort of would sell ourselves on the fact that we were an interdisciplinary school, but we were actually quite limited if one thinks about the full suite of disciplines. I mean, yes, we had people looking at ocean models, we had ecologists, we had a few geographers, but even this very large school and one of the very earliest interdisciplinary environmental science schools and departments in the country was actually still quite limited in its intellectual reach. And even within the school, we were somewhat siloed. I mean, the climatic research unit, for example, where I worked for 12 years, I mean, we hardly interacted at all with anybody in the rest of the school for the whole decade of the 1990s. So I think this idea of putting climate modelers alongside sociologists and engineers, alongside economists and ecologists, alongside geographers, I mean, I just don't think that really happened at all at that stage. It was very difficult to secure funding, independent funding for that type of cross-disciplinary collaboration. I mean, at the time, all the research councils in the UK were separate. They had their own budgets. And actually, the bid that we were successful in securing, the £10 million grant that we got, was, I think, one of the very first times that 3 research councils, economic and social, natural environment, and engineering and physical sciences, had cooperated together on a project of that scale. 10 million was a pretty significant grant in those days. And it was one of the very first big collaborations between the research councils. So they were learning, and actually this was certainly a management challenge for me as the director. I mean, they were learning how to manage and fund an interdisciplinary project just as much as we, as academics, were learning how to execute it.
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, to come back to your point about the humanities and philosophy, I guess on the face of it, one might think that the climate science and modelling with data and so on is quite some remove from philosophy and the humanities. How do you think those 2 things come together in how we understand climate change and how we respond to that? What's your view on that?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, they are absolutely crucial. And I think at the time I wouldn't have appreciated the significance, I think, of those disciplines to what we were doing. And actually the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, wasn't part of the funding consortium. Neither was the Medical Research Council. nor the Biological and Biotechnical Research Council. So you can see there were some lacunae in the consortium that put the funding together for this. But thinking about philosophy and ethics, I mean, one only has to start thinking about modeling as an epistemic practice. What are models? How credible do models, how is the credibility of models established in philosophical terms? Modeling is still regarded in many senses, in many settings within society as a questionable practice. It's not real science. You know, real science is about data, it's about theory, and it's about accuracy. Models don't do any of those things. They combine a whole assortment of epistemic practices in ways that are creative, that are fruitful, but actually are still very, very exploratory and tentative. And we've seen this, you know, very, very clearly in the case of COVID. You know, the challenges of models and modelers, particularly when science runs hot in the middle of a crisis. How does one establish the credibility of a model or a suite of models? And then how does one interpret those model outcomes in the context of difficult policy decisions? And those questions are, at one level, they're philosophical, at another level, they are political, but they also actually are questions about ethics and values. So all those questions really around climate modeling completely escaped me 20 years ago. And then more broadly, the humanities, the value of the humanities in thinking about climate futures. And so much of climate change, it seems to me, is something that exists in the human imagination as much as it exists in a model or in a data set or in a social survey of public opinion. The human imagination is central to the question around climate change, it seems to me. And that, again, would have escaped me 20 years ago. But to me, you know, questions of how I think about the future, what sort of stories we tell, what sort of imaginaries are foregrounded or backgrounded, and how those change as we travel around the world. You know, the way in which people think about climate in a westernized, scientized, post-Enlightenment culture is very, very different from how subalterns in indigenous communities and cultures who have not been exposed to this westernized tradition of thought and practice. And yet climate change matters as much to them, those subalterns, as much as it might do to us. And yet they think about it through story, through myth, through the imagination, in completely different ways. So there are dimensions here that we just didn't even begin to touch on at the beginning of the Tyndall Centre back in 2000.
So it sounds like you're, correct me if I'm wrong, sort of keen to emphasise that the limits of some of how we might think about climate change from a Western scientific point of view, that this is about data and models and, you know, measurable impacts. Is that fair to say? Are we kind of somehow straitjacketed by the way we often do think about climate change, do you think?
That would be my perspective now, thinking and writing about climate change from the perspective of 2020. And it sort of partly plays back as well into one of the founding phrases, I think, in the Tyndall Centre that we set up. And I think, again, we inherited this from the research councils, which was around interdisciplinary research for sustainable solutions. And, you know, we inherited that rubric, and we had quite a few discussions and debates about this, and the idea of what is a solution and what is a sustainable solution to climate change. And I think, you know, we moved away from solutions to talking about responses, which I think is still the phrase that the Tyndall Centre today uses. But the idea that climate change is a problem to which there is a solution is a very limited way of thinking about climate change. It sets it up very much as an engineering challenge, and engineers love those sorts of challenges, and they love finding solutions to those types of challenges. But climate change isn't that type of a phenomenon, it seems to me. And so moving away from that thinking to recognize that there is no single solution here to climate change takes us to thinking around the very different cultures and prospects, future prospects that different communities in different parts of the world are confronted with. Partly this is, of course, around development. We could call this development geography, or recognizing the very different life experiences and prospects that 8 billion people on the planet are facing. But it really is important if one's thinking around the problems of climate change on a planetary scale. This is not just around how a British society or a British culture might respond to the challenges. This is about looking at the problems of climate change through the eyes of very, very different people living in different places and different life circumstances. And that requires different types of knowledge, different types of research, different types of public engagement, different types of institutional designs, if one's really going to bring 8 billion people into the story, which I believe they need to be part of.
And just to touch on that, again, I think you've been you've critiqued the UNFCCC framework in terms of how that has, well, the limits and whether that has been able to achieve that, bringing everyone on board. Could you say a little bit about, how you think global politics of climate change is operating today, and how it might be different?
Well, okay, so we've had, what now, nearly 30 years of the UNFCCC and of the international negotiations. And there have been some highlights and there have been some lowlights along the way. It certainly has taken the framing of climate change as an international global collective action problem, and it's carried the world of international politics along with that framing. And on the back of that, we, under the Paris Agreement, we now have the goals of climate policy enshrined around these two numbers, 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. And on the back of that, the language of carbon budgets and net zero emissions. So these provide the core pillars, if you will, for the way in which the international process of negotiations is taking place. And I understand exactly, how those numbers come to be and why in these types of international policy settings, these numbers, or numbers equivalent to those, are desirable. But I think it's important not to lose sight of the wider questions that are at stake with climate change and the sort of policies that different countries will enact. And this is where my critique comes in. Solving, and we're back to language of solution, if you will, solving climate change is not actually about hitting a particular number, whether it's 1.75 or 2.1, or indeed net zero by 2060 or 2050. Those types of targets are actually standing in for something else. It would seem to me, or at least the argument I would make, they are standing in for something else, which more broadly then is about how we envisage a good human life on a small planet, where different, and here we're getting back to the imaginaries here, different people have different imaginaries or different value sets about what constitutes a good human life on a small planet. So just hitting, you could hit 1.5 degrees, and indeed the more radical way of doing that would be to spray particles into the stratosphere. The environmental engineers would be pretty confident that we could hit 1.5 degrees if we were willing to spray enough particles into the stratosphere. That wouldn't solve the problem of climate change in the eyes of most people, because actually something else is standing in behind these numbers, which are, depending on what your particular ethical and moral stance would be, it is around a redistribution of wealth and power in the world. It's about ensuring adequate access to basic energy, educational, health services for 8 billion people. Maybe it's around maintaining the integrity of certain types of ecosystems and their adequate functioning. Or it actually might be around a project of greater political emancipation and participation. But it's these deeper normative desires actually that lie at the background of climate change. The numbers are only a device or a tactic, but they are not actually the end that most people have in mind when they are thinking about the types of future worlds and future societies they want to live in. So that's why I say don't, the UNFCCC and those international negotiating processes, they are important and they're necessary, but it is always necessary also to point out the other things that are at stake. And these are motivational things that are at stake. Most people really are not motivated by 1.5 or 2 degrees. They're motivated by things that might be closer to home, or they might be motivated by things that engage with their imaginative normative worlds. And for many people, these will have religious associations, questions of the transcendent. And this too is something actually going back to where we were back in 2000. We didn't have any religious studies academics engage with the Tyndall Centre, and I'm not actually sure the Tyndall Centre ever has done over these 20 years. But if we recognise that religious thought and sensibility and practice is important for the vast majority of people on the planet, which it is, then again here we see a form of engagement, a way of entering into the life worlds of many, many people through the ideas of religious thought, belief, practice, imagery, myth and ritual. And those are things that really touch people. For many, they provide motivational resources and inspiration for thinking about what actually it is to live a good life on a fragile planet.
That's fascinating kind of insights, and I think really draws attention to perhaps what is underneath, as you say, underneath a lot of, when we talk about numbers and targets, what is really lying beneath it. So we've come full circle a little bit back to the Tyndall Centre and how it was founded. I did want to ask as well, in terms of sort of looking back on, Tyndall Centre has been going for 20 years now. It was had a fair chunk of funding for the first 10 years and then has carried on as a kind of a coalition of the willing. The CAST Centre itself is in many ways kind of a child of Tyndall. So I would personally think that was one of the big achievements of the Tyndall Centre, was to give rise to the work we're doing within CAST. Could I ask you what you think were the main achievements of the Tyndall Centre while you were director and indeed in the years since?
Oh, well, I think, right from the very beginning, I think that the most important thing that occupied me the first couple of years was creating a sense of community out of roughly around 100 academics spread across 9 different institutions. A sense that by working together across these disciplinary and institutional and geographical barriers and limitations, we could actually create an intellectual community that was creative, that was trusted, and that could produce research of high quality, but also of high public value. And in a way, it was, I think, those early investments into, let's say, the soft infrastructure of the Tyndall Centre, just developing ways of working together, ways of communicating, how we presented ourselves to stakeholders and indeed to other academics around the world. Those were really important things to establish the centre as a significant intellectual capacity in the UK, but also further afield. And I think bringing people together, I think one of the really successful things that we did was to create a community, particularly for PhD students and early career academics, people on relatively insecure contracts, who had great passion and enthusiasm for their research, but they were perhaps working in quite isolated departments in different universities. But by creating a community of early career scholars, a sense that they could actually be part of something much bigger than just their individual PhD. And I think in some senses that is one of the things that I'm most proud of managing to do, to think of all those people who have actually progressed through either academic careers, but also into governmental or non-governmental positions, but they cut their teeth, as it were, within the Tyndall Centre in those first few years in the early 2000s. So I think that was very important, very successful. I think too that the intellectual contributions that the Tyndall Centre made, I think it had a huge impact on the whole question about adaptation to climate change. And my colleague Neil Adger, who was quite instrumental in leading that program, had made a huge contribution to raising the importance of adaptation, both in developed countries but also in developing countries. And on the back of that, of course, is now this whole frame of resilience. That language, that thinking about climate resilience didn't exist in 2000. And I think the Tyndall Centre made a big contribution to pushing that agenda forward. And I think too, questions around decarbonisation. This was particularly taken on by colleagues at Manchester, and continue to push that whole question about thinking about scenario, thinking about how societies move through the transition from where they are today to where they may be in the future. And of course, part of the legacy of this has been picked up by Corinne Le Quéré when she was directing the Tyndall Centre and her Global Carbon Project, which has had enormous impact on the international politics of climate change. So these are things that one can trace back, I think, to some of the early investments that the Tyndall Centre made. And I think one other thing that I would put out there that we did in those early years, and I think it's still very, very important, was to recognise the importance of debate or argumentation. And this, in a way, actually was also the inspiration for the book that you mentioned at the very beginning, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. I wrote that in just after I finished, actually, with the Tyndall Centre when I had a sabbatical year in 2007, 2008. But I was reflecting back on many of the conversations and discussions that we had within the Tyndall Centre. This very eclectic group of people, some senior, some junior, some introverts, some extroverts, some great public communicators, some who just wanted to stay in their office the whole time, some working in sociology, some working in climate modelling, very, very broad, eclectic range of people brought together under the Tyndall umbrella. And what I realised actually through those first few years of running the Tyndall Centre was that although on the one hand we are all invested in this project because we all are concerned about climate change, we are concerned that it does present challenges and risks and dangers in the years that lie ahead. But actually the way in which we see solutions are actually quite different. And we set up a number of these debates in the early years. So we had debates about nuclear, the place of nuclear power, for example, in energy portfolios. We had big disagreements about that. Were geoengineering technologies things that we should even be contemplating? And we set up a debate about that. We had big arguments about the extent to which governments should intervene more directly in terms of regulation, either through taxation or through rationing. Or was that actually an infringement of basic human rights? So these debates, these arguments needed to be brought out into the open, rather than thinking just because we are, as it were, all working together on the same side, that we're somehow magically all going to agree about these very difficult questions, was doing no one any service at all. And so my book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, was seeking to expose these deeper underlying reasons for disagreement. Because until you work through your reasons to disagree with each other, until you work that through and expose them and recognize them and appreciate them, it seems to me you're not going to be able to make good progress in an open democracy to find policy pathways, which are always going to be suboptimal for some people and are going to be resisted by others. But that's a process you've got to work through. It's part of the agonism of a democracy. And I think in the Tyndall Centre, again, we sort of tentatively began to explore some of those points of debate and argument that really have to be brought out into the open if we are going to find policy pathways forward.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Actually, and it brings me to my the next question I wanted to ask, and something we spoke about very briefly before the call. So there are many different ways which, as researchers and academics and wider groups of stakeholders, we might think about climate change and how we respond to it. Do you think our activities as researchers and academics, particularly, can or should seek to change the world, to do something about climate change? Can research offer solutions, or is our job more to document and research and produce that for others to then take on? How would you see that?
No, I think research can and should seek to change the world. Absolutely. If we don't believe that, then we're simply playing an indulgent game amongst ourselves, and we don't deserve the privilege of any public support or funding or recognition at all. No, as researchers, we do expect what we are doing to make a difference. But I think that argument of making a difference, of influencing public life, is different from setting up on a pathway to say we are going to find the solution to climate change. I think that is an over extension of an academic capability. But to influence debates, to provoke debates, to offer new ideas, to act as catalysts, working with stakeholder organizations, and this was something, again, inscribed within the Tyndall Centre right from the very beginning, that we enlisted engagements with a whole variety of public and private sector stakeholder organizations. We should expect to have that type of influence and impact on the wider world through the work and the research that we do. But that is not to say that it is within our remit or capacity to produce solutions. It probably goes back to the problem of a solution framing. Solutions to climate change are elusive. Let's call it that. And I think, at least this is how I come to understand the complexities of the world in which we live and the way in which climate change plays out within the complexities of these worlds. And sometimes climate change is described as a wicked problem that tries to capture something of this, that you can make an intervention that within a particular set of boundary conditions, you can do all the modeling, you can do all the research, and you can do all the experimentation, and within the particular limitations of those boundary conditions, it would say, well, this looks like a good solution. So a classic example, actually, that we studied in the first few years was biofuels. And it led eventually to the Biofuel Directive in the EU to put some of the 7.5 or 10% of the fuel mix in European transportation fuels having to be sourced from biofuels. This sounds a great idea, or it did to quite a number of people in the early 2000s. However, as soon as you move outside of those bounded conditions of displacing a certain proportion of fossil carbon out of your liquid fuels to provide transportation mobility, you begin to realize actually the knock-on consequences of this are that in the interconnected global system that we live in, with the particular economic structures that we have and the desirability for livelihood opportunities, what was happening is, of course, that this was displacing tropical forests, particularly in Southeast Asia, and actually because of the need to source biofuels. And what this actually led to was pushback, not just about the carbon benefits of this biofuel directive, but also the livelihood chances of marginal subalterns in some of the Southeast Asian countries. So this is, climate change is a wicked problem. As soon as you try to think that here is a neat, tidy solution that we can implement, you begin to realize the secondary and tertiary consequences of this. And that is why I think we have to be very, very cautious and careful in the way in which we come up and design and implement particular policies. And this is, again, where academics and research can help. It can extend those boundary conditions and say, well, have you considered relaxing that boundary conditions? And say, well, that therefore will have a consequence elsewhere in the world. And of course, as soon as you start doing this, you find yourself in this constant regress that you simply go round and round in circles, trying to put everything back into place after you've made a particular policy intervention. So I think framing climate change as a wicked problem still seems to me to have great rhetorical appeal. It recognizes the limits of human ingenuity, human foresight, human prescience. It imposes a degree of humility in the way we think about our interventions in the world. It doesn't stop us from intervening, but I think it imposes a degree of humility and a recognizing of our limits as to what we can achieve around the challenges that climate change presents to us.
Thanks. That's a really interesting set of observations. And it brings me a mention of being cautious and careful, as well as climate change being a wicked problem. I wanted to touch on something which is seemed quite pertinent today at the beginning of September 2020. As we speak, there are again activists on the streets of London, Extinction Rebellion, signs of alarming climate impacts, Brazilian rainforest on fire again. And I think for me and many others, I think often this seems very alarming and urgent. And yet I think you yourself have been at pains to caution against talking in terms of deadlines or speaking in terms of climate catastrophe. So you comment on your website, for example, that stories of the sky falling in are not the stories we need to hear. I wonder if you could say something about how we might find ways to act on climate change that reflect both the science and the sense of urgency that many of us do feel about these issues.
Well, yeah, I think that the trope of deadlinism has been around climate change pretty much ever since I embarked on this whole area of research back in the 1980s. There have been a lot of deadlines that have been suggested over the years, many of which have gone and passed already. So in many senses, and actually, there's a credible case to be made that it's already too late. It's not a case of there's a future deadline. Actually, the time to make changes, has long since gone. And this actually is a way of thinking about climate change that does come out of some subaltern thinkers and activists when putting climate change in the context of wider challenges imposed upon them and their communities by colonialism and extractivism. But anyway, these deadlines have gone. And the problem with putting a particular deadline by which certain things have to happen. Well, there are two problems with that. One is that you will reach that deadline and you will not have achieved the things that you say that had to be achieved by that date. And so you get on the other side of the deadline and the world hasn't fallen, the sky hasn't fallen down. And the more times you do that, to me, the less political or psychological traction that trope has with public audiences. And also the other problem with deadlineism is to me, it doesn't reflect the nature of the world. There are no cliff edges out there waiting to be discovered. 1.5 is not a cliff edge. 2 degrees is not a cliff edge. The year 2030 is not a cliff edge. The world is far too messy and contingent for those sort of cliff edges ever to be in existence. So I don't think it does justice to the way in which the world functions, and I also don't think it actually has adequate psychological or political traction. So and it can blow back as well. And again, it comes partly back to the what I said before about how for so many of us, climate change actually lives in our imaginations. It's our imaginary worlds that climate change has invaded. And this sets up all sorts of psychologies of fear, catastrophe, which for some people can be empowering and motivating. For others, it can be just the opposite of that. And I think, again, we can see an awful lot of this coming out with the reactions of different public audiences to COVID. Is this a disease that should terrorize us, that should paralyze us, that we should be prevented from going outside of our houses because of the danger of contracting COVID? Or is this actually something, it's another risk that we have to assimilate alongside many other risks that we live with in the contemporary world? So anyway, my point here is about the psychologies of fear, and I understand why that type of urgency, campaigning urgency, is put out there, but I do think it carries some severe risks along with it. And the other part of your question then, well, how do we reconcile, if you will, the scientific evidence of change alongside our normative desires to see change in our social and political worlds? I think I would just say 2 things to that. I mean, one, partly is back to questions about humility again. The scientific evidence of the future is always contingent and provisional. Science never quite delivers on our promise or on our desire for certainty and security. We see this with climate change, we see this with COVID. Science is always unfinished, and it always leaves room around the edges for contestation and uncertainty. So don't overload whatever political or social campaign you're embarking on. Don't overload that onto science, because science will probably weaken or crack under the pressure of that expectation. And then the other side of the story is, if not to overload science with expectation, is not to overload what is achievable in the world in which we find ourselves in. And I'm not trying to be defeatist here, but I'm trying to steer a course between idealism and fatalism. And so rhetorically, I describe myself as a climate pragmatist. I'm not an idealist. I don't think we can stop the world at 1.5 or probably at 2. We can't solve all of the world's environmental or social evils or bads, but we can do something. And finding that middle pathway of being pragmatic, finding points of intervention where one can make a difference, working with coalition partners in different parts of the world in the public and private sector. It's that type of pragmatic attitude that I would particularly want to promote. And I think we need stories, and there's back to questions about story, what sort of stories can help us get there. I very much like this notion of the trickster character. This comes out of a lot of indigenous cultures, a mythical figure, and the trickster character is someone who always eludes definition, but is always there to unsettle and to provoke. It's almost an embodiment, if you will, of the idea of conscience, human conscience, that many religious traditions are familiar with. And the trickster figure is there to provoke and to raise questions with you. And it's a way of bringing you down to earth, to matching your ambitions of what you want to achieve in the world with your capabilities of being able to achieve that, reconciling those two different dimensions. So to me, that's what pragmatism is. It's about setting up limited goals. It's about being humble in what you can achieve and how you can achieve that, but it's not giving up. And actually, paradoxically, to me that's a more hopeful position to adopt than setting out on an impossible quest. But finding that sort of pragmatic position in the middle there is actually more hopeful, because it means that you can achieve certain things, but you can't achieve everything.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mike. I will take with me the idea of climate pragmatism as a trickster that seeks to unsettle and provoke. I think that's some really good advice at the end there, as well as that how we can keep going, remaining hopeful, but existing in that space between idealism and defeatism. Thank you very much, Mike. I'm going to wrap it up there, because we've taken more of your time than we said we would. I'll hand back to Hannah, if I may, to just offer a couple of final reflections and remind us about our remaining events. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Mike, so much for joining us. It's been really great to hear more about the background of Tyndall, and I think your insights today have been a really valuable companion to our previous webcast that we recorded as part of this series. We had 3 grassroots organisations talking about their learning about how to create wider impact, and something that all 3 of them really agreed on and focused on was the idea of doing, not telling. Because it allowed them to really start from people's values, from not talking about the numbers and the targets, or talking about 1.5 or 2 degrees, but saying, well, we're a repair cafe. Do you feel frustrated that you can't fix your own stuff at home? Well, we're a cargo bike delivery service. This is a practical way that sort of meshes with your own values of meeting a need you have in your life. And in addition to that, I think we wrapped up at the end talking about whether sort of grassroots initiatives like that do kind of shout enough about telling their own stories and telling them what they do. I think they're all coming from a place of you can't be what you can't see, which comes back to that idea of sparking the imagination. If you can't see people nipping around Manchester delivering groceries on cargo bikes, then perhaps it's difficult to tell that story, to imagine that things could be different. And for us at CAST, with the research we create, that provides a really exciting opportunity for us to think about how we spark that imagination, especially as we move into the trialling phase, so the interventions phase of CAST work, and ask that question, how do we live differently and better? And even your idea of climate pragmatism as a trickster, I think is a fantastic way of thinking about it, and perhaps a way of thinking about our research at CAST, to take another kind of story model, is that as we put people at the heart of transformation, people at their different scales as individuals and collective communities and organisations, governments, they're already the heroes. The solution lies with the people. They're at the heart of transformation. And we at CAST and other research, we're the magical helper. So we're coming in with the just the little helping hand to help that transformation come about. So thank you. I found that absolutely fascinating. We're really glad you were able to join us today. If you've been listening along to Stuart and Mike's discussion and you want to find out more about Mike's work and Tyndall research, then we will be linking that from the CAST website. That's cast.ac.uk. And we hope that you will be joining us for next week's live webinars. We've got one on Monday, the 14th of September, starting at 1 p.m. That's all about transforming food and the stuff we buy. And on Tuesday, the 15th, at the same time, 1 p.m., we have a webinar on transforming travel and energy and how we heat and cool our homes. We'll be hearing from CAST and Tyndall researchers on the science of climate action. We'll also be hearing from a really amazing range of community, third sector and grassroots organisations who have successful stories of change to share. And of course, there'll be a chance for you to get involved in the discussion as well and share your own insights and your own experiences. To book onto those free events, you just go to cast.ac.uk, or you can find us on Twitter at cast_centre. And once again, thank you, Stuart, thank you, Mike, and thank you for everyone who's listened in today. Bye from us.